Today, I bring you another scary story that arrived directly in our email. Each story I receive is carefully edited to keep the horror just right, while protecting the identity of those who choose to share their most sinister moments with us. Now, it's worth remembering, I believe what they tell me, but I can't prove that everything really happened. At the end of the day, the decision to believe or not is yours. My name is Cloves, and for many years I was a gravedigger in the cemetery of Vila de São Bartolomeu, a forgotten village high in the mountains of Minas Gerais. For many people, that cemetery was a place of fear, full of stories that no one wanted to remember. But for me, it was almost home. Not that I lived inside it, of course, but my house was so close that at night I could hear the wind whistling between the tombstones. That cemetery was old, almost as old as the village itself. They say the first settlers built it around 1800, but now, in 1972, it was just an abandoned place. The weeds were growing out of control, the chapel in the middle of the land was falling apart, and the cracked walls looked like they were going to collapse at any moment. The authorities barely remembered that it existed, and the few burials that took place were of poor people who had no other option. I took care of the cemetery alone. You swept up the dry leaves, straightened the crosses knocked down by the wind, and placed flowers on the forgotten graves. It wasn't an easy job, but I did it with respect. I always believed that if no one else cared for the dead, someone had to. They deserve it, right? But I'll tell you something. I'm not stupid. I know cemeteries carry a different weight. The people of the village kept saying, "Don't go up there at night. Souls don't rest." But I never called. I spent many early mornings there, sometimes digging a grave until late, other times just listening to the silence. And you want to know? Silence can be much scarier than any noise. It was on a grey afternoon that it all began. I was arranging some tombstones when I heard the roar of an engine coming up the dirt road. But it wasn't just any car. It was one of those big black ones, shining like it had just come out of an agency. A car like that only appeared there for a reason. And that's how my life changed forever. I stopped what I was doing and looked. The black car stopped right at the entrance to the cemetery. Two men in suits came out, serious, as if they were used to dealing with things that no one else wanted to know about. Right behind them, a priest appeared. He was already old, with a tired face and a heavy look, as if he were carrying an invisible burden. "Good afternoon, sir," said one of the men, dry as the cold winter wind. "We brought a body to be buried. It's urgent. Burials were my job, so far no big deal." But something about the way they spoke, the way they looked around, made me suspicious. They seemed nervous. I looked at the coffin they were carrying, simple dark wood, but there was something wrong with that scene. "Are you the gravedigger?" The priest looked at me as if he wanted more than an answer. "Yes, I am, sir." "But who passed away?" They exchanged glances. They didn't like the question. It was clear. One of the men cleared his throat before responding. "A woman. We are not permitted to disclose details. We just need a discreet location." Discreet? I had seen a lot of things in that cemetery, but this was strange even to me. They wanted a quick burial without registration. But no matter how much my curiosity screamed, it wasn't my place to ask questions. "Right, I'll prepare the place." I chose a far corner, where the tombstones were almost covered by weeds. As I dug, I felt the priest's gaze fixed on me. He never looked away from me or the coffin, as if he expected something to come out at any moment. "Are you okay, Father?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my forehead. He hesitated but replied, "Just pray, so that evil does not overtake this place." That gave me goosebumps. I've always been a practical man. I never cared for haunted stories. But the tone of his voice bothered me. When we finished, they wasted no time. The priest said a quick prayer and the men in suits threw dirt on the coffin as if they wanted to get rid of it as quickly as possible. After everything, the priest took me aside and handed me a white candle. "Mr. Cloves, keep it lit at night. It's important." "Why?" I asked, suspicious. He looked at me seriously and replied, "To keep away what does not belong to the world of the living." That night, when silence took over the cemetery, I stayed with the candle by my side. I didn't know what bothered me more, the priest's words or that strange feeling as if something was out of place. And that's when the whispers started. The next day, I went back to work as usual. The cemetery looked the same. Old, forgotten, quiet, but there was something wrong. The silence was heavy, dense, as if it was hiding something. It was then that I saw the candle. I had left it lit all night, protected inside a glass lantern. But now it was completely erased and consumed. It was the wind, I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I continued my routine, sweeping the paths between the tombs. I passed the corner where we had buried the woman. Everything seemed normal. The earth was still cool, but that was it. The strange thing was that feeling as if something was there, watching me. I'm not one to pray, but at that moment, I made the sign of the cross and whispered softly, "God, protect me." I thought if it was just in my head, it would calm me down. But at night, things were different. My house was simple, a bed, a table, and a window that looked out onto the cemetery, enough to live. After dinner, I sat down with a glass of cachaça to relax. It was quiet until I heard it. It was low, but it was there. Whisper. It sounded like someone speaking in secret, but I couldn't understand the words. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. I looked outside at the graves scattered across the hill. Nothing, but the whispers continued. I closed the window and tried to ignore it. It's just in my head, I thought. But to be honest, my heart was racing. Why the hell was I listening to that? I decided to go out and have a look. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and shovel because, well, you never know. Outside, the night was cold and still, absolute silence except for my footsteps on the wet grass. But the whispers, those strange whispers seemed to move, coming from different places, as if they were playing with me. I went straight to the woman's grave. Deep down, I already knew there was something wrong with that. When I got there, my feet froze. The earth was turned over. It didn't look like animal work. It felt like something had come out of there. I bent down to take a closer look, feeling a shiver run up my spine. My flashlight shook in my hand, but I forced the light forward. And then I heard it again, the whispers, this time louder. And in the midst of them, I could have sworn I heard my name. Cloves, that's when I ran away. Call me a coward, but I'm just a man. And that was too much. I closed my door, locked everything, and spent the rest of the night sitting, up in bed, holding the flashlight and candle the priest gave me. I prayed like I had never prayed before. The next day, I did what any sensible person would do. I went to church. I needed to know who that woman was. The funeral priest was no longer there, but another priest named Antonio welcomed me. He was young, full of energy, but when I told him what happened, his demeanor changed. He heard everything in silence. And when I finished, I said just one thing. You shouldn't have gone near that tomb. His words weighed heavy on my chest. It was as if he knew something he didn't want to say. What do you mean by that, Father? He hesitated, adjusted. His glasses looked at the wooden floor of the church. Sometimes the dead carry things that the living cannot understand, he said. And what was buried in that cemetery shouldn't be there. I swallowed hard. You're telling me that woman? He sighed. I can't say anything without proof. But the other priest, He mentioned that there was something unusual about this case. That body should not have been buried there, then why was it? Antonio was silent for a moment before responding, because no one else would accept it. That phrase kept ringing in my head as I walked back to the cemetery. They brought the body because no one else wanted to accept it, and now I was the one paying the price. That night, I took every precaution I could. I relit the candle the priest gave me. I put coarse salt around the house, something my grandmother always said to ward off evil. I didn't know if it would help, but something was wrong, and I needed to protect myself. But protection didn't seem enough. Around midnight, the noises started again, but this time it wasn't just whispers. They were steps, light footsteps, as if someone were walking among the tombs. I went to the window. Nothing, but the footsteps continued. I had locked everything away, but I felt like it didn't make a difference. Suddenly the candlelight flickered, and then a voice whispered something that made my blood run cold. You opened the door. The door creaked, even though it's locked. I jumped up, holding the flashlight and shovel as if they were weapons. Who's there? I tried to scream, but my voice was weak. Silence. For a moment, then I heard a sound. Behind me, in the bedroom. I turned around and saw something I will never forget. A shadow, high, thin, projected on the wall, but there was no one there to cast that shadow. She moved, alone. The candle went out. Everything went dark. Cloves. The voice whispered again, closer. I ran away. I'm not brave. I'm not a hero. I opened the door and ran outside, stumbling through the darkness until I reached the cemetery chapel. It was the only place that felt safe to me. I closed the door behind me and knelt before the altar, trying to catch my breath. The chapel was in ruins, broken benches, images of saints covered in dust, but still, it was a place of faith. I picked up a cross and held it tight. Silence came again, but it wasn't a normal silence. It was a heavy silence, difficult to breathe. And then the door creaked. Someone was pushing. Trying to get in, I started to pray. I didn't remember the words exactly, but I prayed as best I could. Then the pushing stopped. Silence returned, but something was wrong. I heard a knock, not at the door, inside the chapel. Pointing the flashlight, I illuminated the benches, the dark corners. Nothing, until the light stopped at something that made me almost drop the flashlight. On the wall, next to the altar, someone had written with land or with blood, I don't know, but it was there. She never left. That night, I didn't even think about going home. I stood there, on the cold floor of the chapel, holding the cross tightly and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I went straight to the church to tell Father Antonio everything that had happened. He listened to me in silence, but when I spoke from the tomb, his look became even more serious. Cloves. I think we need to dig up that coffin. My heart raced. I knew this wasn't going to end well. My first reaction was to say no. It wasn't just fear. Although I was terrified, it seemed wrong to disturb the rest of the dead. But the priest insisted, "Cloves, this is no ordinary body. You know that. I need your help." I stayed quiet. Basically, he was right. Since the day that coffin was buried, nothing had been normal. As much as my instinct screamed at me to run away, I knew I needed to do something. "Right, Father," I replied after much thought. "But I need to know, what exactly are we facing?" He looked out the sacristy window as if he didn't want to say it out loud. "I don't know everything. But there are stories about people like her. Women who, in life, dealt with dark things, pacts, curses. When they die, they don't rest." The word pacts made me shudder. It was not uncommon to hear stories of witches in the region, especially in the most remote parts of Minas. They said they did work to harm others, but I always thought it was just a legend. "So you think she was a witch?" I asked, trying not to stutter. The priest took a deep breath. "Not just a witch, she did something worse." He didn't explain further, But the look in his eyes said it all. He didn't know if we were ready for what we were going to find. In the evening, we returned to the cemetery. The place was shrouded in darkness. It was just me and the priest. We couldn't involve anyone else. Who would believe us? I grabbed the shovel and we started digging. The earth was heavier than normal, as if something down there was trying to stop us. With each layer removed, the air seemed to grow denser, until suddenly I smelled a horrible smell, something rotten mixed with iron. "Are you feeling this?" I asked. The priest nodded but did not stop. His hands shook, but he dug as if his life depended on it. And maybe it really did depend. When we finally reached the coffin, I hesitated. He was different. Marks had appeared on the wood, carved symbols that had not been there on the day of the burial, intertwined lines and geometric figures that seemed wrong, as if they had been made by hands that did not belong to this world. Cloves. Hold. "The flashlight?" the priest asked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He picked up a crucifix and began to mutter a prayer. I didn't know if it would help, but the sound of his voice calmed me down a little. When we opened the coffin, the world seemed to stop. The body was there, but it wasn't the way it should be. No signs of decomposition. The woman's face remained intact, pale as wax, but the eyes were open, fixed on us. I almost dropped the lantern, but the priest caught my arm. "Don't look directly," he said hurriedly. "And now, what do we do?" My voice almost didn't come out. Before he could respond, something happened. The air became heavy, as if a storm was about to break out. Then came the sound. First, a low, distant murmur. Then laughter, lots of laughs. Some low, some high, all mixed together. The priest began to pray louder, but the voices also increased, until one of them stood out, clear and dark. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight went out. I found myself in the dark, hearing the priest shout in Latin. The coffin began to shake. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like we needed to get out of there. "Father, we have to leave." "Adieu," I shouted. "No," he replied. "We have to finish the ritual." The floor vibrated. The smell of rot became unbearable. Something was there, something we couldn't see, but that surrounded us. Then, suddenly, I felt a force push me back. I fell to the floor. When I got up, I saw the priest being dragged away from the tomb. He held the crucifix tightly, but something invisible was pulling him quickly towards the chapel. I ran after him, calling his name, but the cemetery itself seemed to be against me. The tombstones seemed to shift, blocking my path. Shadows danced around me. When I finally arrived at the chapel, the door slammed in my face. "Father," I shouted, knocking on the door, but it wouldn't open. Inside, I heard the priest praying, shouting, until everything became silent. The door opened by itself. The priest was no longer there, and on the wall, above the altar, there was a message written in blood. "She is already released." I was paralyzed. I didn't know if the priest was alive or dead, but one thing was certain. He was taken by something I couldn't understand. That thing was free. The cemetery was no longer a resting place. It was a battlefield. I picked up the crucifix that the priest had dropped and left the chapel. Mist covered the tombstones, and the air was as cold as ice. I returned home, but the feeling of security was gone. As soon as I closed the door, I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from outside. A cry, a woman's cry. I thought about ignoring it, but the sound didn't stop. I took the flashlight and left, shaking from head to toe. The crying came from the big tree near the cemetery wall. When the light from the flashlight illuminated the area, I saw a figure sitting on the floor, facing away from me, a woman with long black hair, wearing a white dress, torn and dirty with dirt. And then she stopped crying, and he turned his head to me. I swallowed hard and tried to remain calm, but my voice was shaky when I asked, "Ma'am?" She stopped crying. Slowly he turned his head, as if each movement was heavy. difficult. When he finally looked at me, my entire body froze. Her face was the same as the woman we had buried. "Why did you wake me up?" Her voice was low but filled with anger. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My hands were shaking so much that the flashlight slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor, turning off the only light I had. The silence grew thick around me. In the dark, I tried to reach for the flashlight, but it was gone. It was then that I felt it. Behind me. Something. I turned slowly. A tall shadow, much taller than anyone, was standing just a few meters away from me. She wasn't human. His arms were too long, his head tilted to the side as if studying me. Before I could run, she moved. Too fast. An invisible force hit me, throwing me to the ground so violently that I lost my breath. The creature stood over me, and even though it had no eyes, I knew it was staring at me. "You shouldn't have messed with me," he said, his voice echoing as if 1,000 mouths were speaking at the same time. I struggled to get up. My heart hammered in my chest. I held the crucifix as if my life depended on it, and maybe it did. When I touched the shadow with the crucifix, it recoiled and let out a scream. It was no ordinary scream. It was like breaking glass, a sound that made my ears hurt. I took the chance and ran. Stumbling, dragging myself, I made my way back home. I went in, locked the door, and threw myself on the floor, trying to understand what was happening. The woman we buried, or whatever she was, wasn't just a witch. It was something much worse. It was then that I remembered the priest. He said we needed to finish the ritual, but didn't explain how. I took the crucifix, a candle, and returned to the chapel. I knew it was a bad idea, but I didn't see any other way out. The chapel was dark and silent, but I felt like I wasn't alone. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the air was heavy. The priest's prayer book was still on the altar, open to a marked page. I approached and saw the notes scribbled in the margin: "Purify the place, burn the origin, faith above all." I didn't fully understand, but I knew I needed to do something with the coffin. I took everything I found in the chapel: candles, holy water, matches, and returned to the tomb. The path seemed endless. The cemetery was filled with whispering voices, shadows moving around me. When I got there, the coffin was open. The body, gone. I didn't think. I just acted. I poured the holy water, lit the candles, and began to pray. The voices around me grew louder, shouting, laughing, swearing, but I continued. Suddenly, I felt an ice-cold hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly. She was there. His gaze was pure hatred, but something was different. It seemed weaker. I took a lit candle and threw it into the tomb. The fire spread fast. The shadows writhed. Her scream filled the cemetery, piercing, horrible, until silence returned. I fell to my knees, exhausted. I looked at the flames burning. What was left of that curse? I thought it was over, but then I heard a whisper, faint but clear: "This is not the end." The fire went out. Everything was silent, but it wasn't the usual cemetery silence. It was something deeper. The air seemed still, trapped. For a moment, I believed the nightmare was over, but that whisper haunted me. I returned home, but I couldn't sleep. My head was throbbing. My hand was shaking from holding the crucifix. The fear hadn't gone away. Something inside me said that it wasn't over yet. The next morning, I went to church. Father Antonio was not there. His only thing was his prayer book, abandoned on the altar. I sat on one of the benches, trying to understand what to do. I was alone. The priest had disappeared, and no one in the village even seemed to notice. I went back to the cemetery. Something was strange. Everything seemed calm. The shadows disappeared. The voices fell silent. Had I succeeded? Had she finally left? But then, I saw it. The chapel door was ajar. Inside, a low, almost imperceptible sound. I walked in and felt the air freeze. In the center of the chapel where the altar used to be, there was something new. A mirror, an old dusty mirror with a gold frame and cracks scattered across the glass. I had never seen that there before. I approached. My reflection was there. But something was wrong. I wasn't moving like I should. As I stood still, my image tilted its head, as if it were watching me. It was then that I heard her voice again, this time, coming from inside the mirror. "You can't run away from me, Cloves." Backed away, my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. The image in the mirror has changed. It wasn't me anymore. It was her. Before I could react, the mirror began to crack, and a sharp sound filled the chapel. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The crack spread until suddenly the mirror exploded, throwing me against the wall. When the dust settled, I looked at the altar. Nothing, the mirror is gone. But I knew the truth. She was still there. The fire was not enough. She was caught between the world of the living and the dead, and somehow I was the connection between the two. I returned home exhausted, my mind a whirlwind of questions. I grabbed a bottle of cachaça and sat down, trying to organize my thoughts. "Why me?" I murmured. I was just the gravedigger. I never asked to be involved in this. It was then that I noticed something strange. Next to the bottle, the crucifix that I had taken to the grave the night before, but he was different, warm, as if it had been left in the sun. I picked it up carefully, and as soon as I touched it, a shiver ran through my body. It was neither pain nor comfort. It was a warning. At that moment, everything made sense. The priest was right. I needed to purify everything, the tomb, the chapel, the cemetery, even my house. Evil was permeated in every corner. If I wanted to put an end to this, I would have to face the entity head-on. No turning back. I took the crucifix, the prayer book, and everything I could use. It was time for reckoning. The night was darker than ever when I left the house. The cemetery looked like a monster with its mouth open, waiting for me. Fog crept across the ground, shadows stretched, and the wind carried whispers. My first destination was the chapel. That place was the heart of evil. I placed candles around the altar, forming a circle. I poured the holy water and began to pray. At first, my voice was weak, but soon I took a breath. "Lord, purify this place, drive away evil." The ground shook, the wind blew out the candles. That's when I heard her laugh. "Do you think you can send me away so easily?" Her voice echoed, coming from all directions. I ignored it. I continued praying and holding the crucifix steady. The air became heavy, almost impossible to breathe. The shadows moved, as if they had a life of their own. Then she appeared. Or rather, it appeared. What was once a woman was now a twisted creature, black eyes like endless holes. She whispered my name. "Cloves, you're in my territory." I took a deep breath and lifted the crucifix. "I will purify everything." She moved forward, but I continued praying and spreading the holy water. Each drop burned her skin, and she screamed. A sound that made my blood run cold. The altar caught fire. But it wasn't a normal fire, it was blue, pure. The creature retreated but did not disappear. "Do you think that's enough?" she scoffed. "I'm part of this place," and disappeared. The fire lit up the cemetery, but I knew the fight wasn't over yet. I walked to the tomb. The earth moved, as if something was trying to get out of there. I remembered the priest's note, "Burn the origin." It was my last chance. I spilled the fuel and threw the lit candle. The fire took over the tomb. But then she emerged from the flames, and she wasn't alone. Shadowy figures emerged around them, faces distorted, eyes filled with hate. "You cannot destroy what belongs here," she shouted, and the shadows advanced. I started praying again, but it was difficult. Every shadow that approached sapped my energy. My legs were shaking, my voice broke, but I continued. I held the crucifix tightly. A shadow tried to touch me. I placed the crucifix against her, and she fell apart in a deafening scream. I remembered the priest's words, faith above all. Lord, purify this place, I screamed with everything I had left. The fire in the tomb grew, the shadows receded. But the woman resisted. She looked at me, and for a second, I thought I was going to win. But then the crucifix glowed, an intense light as if the sky itself had descended to earth. The creature screamed, backed away, and disappeared. Silence took over the cemetery. The fire went out. The tomb was empty. I fell to my knees without strength. He finished. Over the next few days, the cemetery looked different, calmer. Residents returned to visit their dead, and I knew my mission was over. It was time to leave. Before leaving, I went to church one last time. Father Antonio was never found, but his book was there. I left it at the altar, in his memory. When I looked at the cemetery for the last time, I felt relief, peace. But deep down, a doubt haunted me. Did she really leave? Years later, I learned that the cemetery was closed. Reforms, they said, but some whispered that strange things had happened again. Today, I live far from that village. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard at night, I hear whispers in the distance. So, do you believe that the dead can carry dark secrets? What would you do in Cloves's place? Leave your opinion in the comments, and if you had the courage to come this far, share this story with someone who also likes scary mysteries. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next video, if you're still here.